Hello and welcome to the My Dietitian Journey Podcast. My name is Adam, your co-host and producer. With me, of course, Felicia of Peraza Nutrition and My Dietitian Journey. Fame and fortune, links to the socials in the description. We're going to get into some stuff a little different this time. We're focusing more, we're circling back to our roots.
Oh, yes.
Where we're talking about, how to be a dietitian in the practice. So we're going to get into, what is it?
Self-monitoring with your patients.
Self-monitoring, tools, techniques, tips and tricks, other words that start with T, probably.
Techniques.
Yeah, there it is. So self-monitoring, what is it? What is self-monitoring?
So it's defined by the International Journal of Behavioral Nutrition and Physical Activity as keeping a record of a specific behavior as a method for changing behavior. So you're basically assessing or observing and recording your behavior, which can really help with increasing awareness about a behavior. It can also help a patient to modify a behavior more effectively, and also maybe cope with different situations, and then also identify ways to modify things to reach their goals. But it's basically increasing self-awareness, bringing attention to a specific behavior.
So I think the first thing a lot of people think when they hear self-monitoring might be like apps and lists and things like that. We're going to talk about the specific forms of it, but did you want to talk about some of the why this is a good idea to do it first?
Yeah, so there is research on it, and we'll link the studies. So there's some journal articles that show that interventions using self-monitoring as a behavior change technique has the possibility to reduce sedentary behavior in adults. So it's been linked with reducing sedentary behaviors, also helping to adhere to lifestyle behavior changes, so eating, monitor, and also activity. And then there's also some research that shows it can help with increasing physical activity and helping improve weight loss. So there is supporting evidence to show that it can be beneficial for patients.
So a lot of clout backing this. People have done studies. I've seen studies. Do you want to talk about like specific forms of self-monitoring? Do you have a recommended or do you have a favorite?
I do have a favorite. Well, I guess it kind of depends, but there's a ton of ways. Most people, when they think about self-monitoring, it's like food journaling. That's like the biggest thing that comes into play, which I will say is something that I do utilize in my practice. So I guess that is my go-to.
Food journaling.
Food journaling.
Can you talk a little bit about what you have patients do for that?
So if it's a new patient, and depending on what their goals might be, but usually I have them track for a 7-day period. And one, that's really helpful to see what they're doing on the weekend, because for most people, they're eating differently Monday through Friday, and then, another way.
I do that. That's me.
Another way on the weekend. And so that's usually they'll do a tracking 7-day log. I have a template that I send people if they're going to do like pen and paper tracking versus if they're going to use an app. There's a ton of different apps out there where you can like just scan barcodes and whatnot. But I have patients track their food, the timing of their meals, the beverages that they're consuming, obviously exactly what they're eating, the portions. And then I also have like modified trackers where they might track like their mood, their hunger scale before and after eating. So if it's just, focused in on like information gathering about their current habits, usually it's just like the specific food, the timing, and then the beverages.
I've seen you scan labels with your phone.
Yes.
What do you use?
So I use an app called Chronometer. And a lot of it I've been personally tracking to monitor like my macros with lifting. So trying to identify like more of like a fed state versus not, and how that might impact the lifts that I have. So I do use Chronometer, and it's free. They do have ads on it. There's a bunch of other ones out there.
Like $2 to get the ads removed.
Probably.
Or whatever.
I think
Just curious.
They do subscriptions now versus like a one-time buy.
So that's one option. You use it to track your macros because you're getting yoked in the gym and you want to make sure you get enough protein and whatnot. It's one reason to do it, right? I mean, that's a reason to track.
That is a reason. Yeah. It brings some attention It's really easy to just kind of go about your day and just eat things that are in front of you, or grab this and grab that. So
we've got apps. You could do voice memos. You could do worksheets. There's like a book you could use or whatever. If you have like a journal for it.
Yeah, I've had patients too use like the note section on their phone. So like an app sometimes can be really helpful because you're obviously seeing a lot of data when you're putting in that information, but sometimes that could be a little too overwhelming or triggering for people, which we're going to talk about. So for some people, they'll just track in like a note section on their phone because it's a lot easier for them as they carry their phone along with them all day long versus, you know,
True.
a pen and paper kind of thing.
You don't carry a pen and paper, a large book with you, an easel to do some art whenever it inspires you. How do you determine what's important to track?
So definitely want to make sure it's personalized. I always kind of look at, I mentioned that with a lot of my patients, I have them do like a 7-day log. Now, if someone's coming into an appointment and, you know, they're there to monitor, let's say they're looking to manage their A1C, I might not just start right off with 7-day food tracking. I usually do like a recall during the appointment, get an idea of like their current behaviors. I might start with just education. So I don't necessarily want to jump into tracking with someone because that could be pretty overwhelming. But first thing is I always talk about what kind of behaviors are going to be monitored. This should be based on the patient, what their goals are, and then thinking about the detail that it's going to have. Like I said, the time, the date, obviously that's going to be important in terms of like how frequent their meals are throughout the day. If they're going long periods without eating, sometimes that could be, you know, the next meal might be really large in terms of like a portion size.
Like a whole pizza.
Maybe.
As an example of a large meal.
That definitely.
I've eaten recently, maybe. Sometimes. Should I be tracking my whole pizza?
I mean, you have some awareness to it, so that's a lot of it.
So I'm good. My dietitian told me I don't need to track that.
But the description of the food, you know, the quantity of food, that kind of stuff, just the details. Now, I don't normally have, unless someone's using an app where they're like getting calorie information, grams of fat, all of that. I normally just have them track their straight up food, the beverages, all of that. I can get an idea of like what their protein looks like, what their calories look like, all of that by looking at their logs. So I don't need them to be necessarily like finding all that information. So if they're not using, again, an app that has the information for them, that can be pretty overwhelming.
It's not just food though. I mean, it's like physical activity, other forms of activity, I guess they could be tracking. Is it just food or do they track everything?
So if I have them just doing like a food journal, they're just tracking their food intake and beverage intake. If I have them doing like a 7-day log and I'm trying to get an understanding of like their overall behaviors, or we're looking at their food intake pattern because let's say they're trying to lose weight and we're trying to see, you know, is it something to shift in their diet or, you know, is it the exercise, the movement, that kind of thing. Then I do have them also track their physical activity. But that could also be just what someone tracks. You know, we're talking about food journaling in particular, but when you're self-monitoring, it is a behavior. So food intake is one aspect of that, but like sleep is another one. A lot of people get their sleep tracked through like fitness watches and things like that. Another thing could be just tracking exercise or, you know, the forms of exercise and the movements that you're doing and like lifts, especially if someone's, you know, doing like strength training. So there's a lot of other forms of, you know, and things that you might be looking at when you are self-monitoring, not just limited to food journaling.
Are there apps that you like in particular? What do you recommend your patients do if they're going to do something electronic?
So if they're going to do an app, usually, well, I used to recommend MyFitnessPal, but then they updated their app and they took away a bunch of free features like the barcode scanner. And they also really push people into using like a subscription now. So I actually recommend Chronometer a whole bunch just because it still has ads on it, but you can barcode scan, you can add in custom foods and you can still scan barcodes with like the free version. And then you see a breakdown of like the macros, micronutrients. And I suggest that over like calorie counters because they're just looking at calories. And it's really important to look at the breakdown of obviously what your patient is consuming. If you're watching this as a dietitian, you're like, obvious. That's an obvious point to make. But that's a really important point for me is I want to make sure that, you know, they're not just seeing calories and saying like, oh, my calories are too high or too this, but seeing like the breakdown of like how much fiber they have, how much added sugar they have. So Chronometer is one. We've talked about in the podcast before that I have done some contract work in the bariatric bariatric facility and an outpatient. And there's an app called Baritastic. So that's a really good app for pre and post bariatric surgery too.
I imagine there are other apps that are specific to certain situations maybe. It's something we could explore, leave some links in the description. If anyone's interested and we find anything cool, I'll leave it down there. So you mentioned that you don't always start people off on self-monitoring tools. How do you determine when it's appropriate, or when is it appropriate to actually utilize these tools?
So it really depends on the patient. Like I've had a few new patients recently where, we're going through their food intake, and one in particular looking at like A1C levels, and their A1C was elevated. We wanted to try to decrease that. I did a recall during the session to kind of get an idea of their eating patterns, but we wanted to keep an eye on added sugar, fiber, overall carbohydrates, but like the type of carbohydrates. And just with that much information to look at, we both together thought it'd be really helpful for them to do some food journaling. So in that case, we're trying to, on a consistent basis, monitor what their fiber looks like, how much protein are they getting, and really looking at, again, like more detailed information between appointments. And then they were sending me those logs. I would review them and help to give them some suggestions. I've also recently had patients where they have chronic kidney disease, and we need to keep an eye on like potassium levels. And so as they're tracking, they're noting like how much potassium they're having. And so for me, I could say like, hey, this is a really high source. Let's swap it with this food instead. So usually it's, monitoring for specific information, maybe a specific disease state, but I have that conversation with the patient in that first or second appointment when we start to talk about like monitoring certain behaviors. It can also be really helpful for someone who is maybe in a stage where they're not ready to change a certain behavior, or they're not realizing how much their behaviors can be influencing their health. So it can help to bring awareness if someone is maybe in the stage of pre-contemplation or contemplation, to just bring some awareness to their current routines. Like I've had people say, I don't know why I'm not losing weight. I don't know why my A1C is so high. I don't know why this and that. And so we start with journaling. Let's just kind of get an idea of what your current routine looks like, your meals, your sleep pattern, your hydration status. And then from that, we can take a look at maybe some adjustments to make.
So it depends on the stage of, and pre-contemplation, contemplation, trans-theoretical model, we covered it in the past. I can link to those episodes if anyone's curious or interested and they haven't heard of those terms before, they're not sure what the context is. So how do you bring it up without, how do you introduce talking about this stuff in your sessions with patients, especially if they're not really doing well? I imagine it's difficult to navigate a little bit. So how do you go about that?
So especially if someone has started tracking, and that could be a really difficult conversation to bring up at an appointment. Be like, you've done some food tracking, tell me about it. Or here's what I noticed. I don't really start there. Usually when they come into the appointment, and I do virtual. So, when they're coming into the session, I might kind of check in. How did the last couple of weeks go? Any questions you want to start with? And then I might say, you sent me over your food logs. I took a look through them. Before we get into, some of the things that I might have seen on there, I'm just curious, is there anything that stood out to you when you did the tracking, or anything that you learned about your behaviors? And that really opens the door for kind of seeing where they're at. For some people, they'll say, I noticed I ate a ton of sugar. I noticed that I don't eat any vegetables. I noticed that I thought I ate more fruit than I really did, or I'm skipping meals, or whatever it might be. That's really helpful actually to bring down some of the kind of resistance and shame. Because if we just start the appointment with me saying like, you don't do this, it's like they're coming in to be slapped on the wrist. It's like really not a good approach that I found. So I try not to jump right into feedback, and I instead ask them anything that stood out to you, anything that you noticed, or anything you learned about yourself after tracking for the last week.
I guess it could also help too if they did track and they tracked well, to give them sort of a pat on the back, like, hey, thanks for doing this. Congratulations on being able to track this well. This looks really good. Stuff like that, to just sort of even maybe pad the blow if you're like, by the way, what's up with all these donuts, something like that.
A lot of times I'll say to someone like, thanks for sending over your food logs. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate, how much time you spent, or something along those lines. And it's not just me saying it to say it. I mean, I do appreciate when they send over the logs, especially ahead of time, because then I can kind of, take a scan through. And sometimes when I start that conversation, like, what stands out to you? The first thing they'll say is like, I know I ate 6 cookies, and they'll start like talking and justifying without me even saying anything besides like what stood out to you. It's like they want to jump to it, so I'm not bringing it up. And again, that could be a lot of like shame and resistance, and acknowledging, like I always say to people, I really appreciate the honesty that you had in your food logs, because that helps me and that also helps you. And I'm not here to judge your eating habits. It's us working together to kind of see what's working, what's not, what are some adjustments that could be helpful. And I always come from the framework of trying to add before taking things away. And I say that to my patients, I don't want to start with like taking away all of these things. It's like, let's talk about the things that we can add to your current intake.
Do you consider the patient's relationship with food tracking in terms of managing how they feel about it, or how they feel about the process of doing it? So like, starting with a thanks and congratulations, it made me think of like, and then they jump into a negative thing. And then maybe you can shore it up at the end with like, well, you did this, and like you bring up the positive stuff at the end, the old compliment sandwich routine where it's like good, bad, good. Do you actively manage the relationship a patient has with these tools and the capacity they're doing it?
Yeah, that's something that's kind of always on my mind, because what I don't want to happen, and this is something that we'll talk about, is for some people tracking can be too emotionally triggering, like negative emotions. And that's not helpful. That's not conducive to any kind of, not just, relationship that you have with your patient, but also for them making behavior change, because then it's also a lot of shame and guilt wrapped up to it. And a lot of times in those instances, that might trigger someone to make an initial change, but it's really not usually sustained. So like the negative kind of enforcement usually isn't the most helpful. And it also sets up like a really bad dynamic that I find sometimes, where it's like they're just coming in to confess all of the bad things that they've done. And it's not like us working together on, trying to improve their relationship with food and make positive changes. So in that case, I always try to make sure that, if let's say they're doing some tracking for a little bit and they are really upset about the foods that they're eating, and there's lots of like shame, guilt. I can't believe I did this. I can't believe I did that. Sometimes we need to move a little bit away from tracking and focus on other ways for them to monitor their behaviors. So I'm trying to usually keep an eye on that, because sometimes too much of that negativity, it's just going to derail their progress.
It's so interesting to me the way this stuff goes with patients and food, because there's like a really strong emotional relationship between a person and what they eat. And it's a weird thing, because you'd think food is objective, but patients, people, I, myself, everyone just has like an emotional relationship. They feel a certain way about the way they eat. So I guess that complicates things in terms of how you would talk to them about what they're doing. Are there any other tactics or like things you do with when you're giving feedback, I guess, to their food logs?
So I definitely try to be very positive. Like, let's see what's working. I've noticed that you had vegetables 5 days out of the week. That is a really big thing that I try to focus in on. So even if they start with all the negative, I don't jump into like problem solving mode. Say like, okay, like, address what they brought up, with the sugar content or this and that, but then shift into, let's see what's working. What things are behaviors that we want to maintain? And again, we're talking a lot more about like food journaling aspect, because that's obviously a big piece of what you're going to see with, patients that you're working with in like the nutrition space. But, there's other behaviors that you might be focusing on outside of food. I usually try to bring like objectivity to it. So like any patterns, do you notice that you eat, differently on the weekends than you do during the week? For most people, again, yes, they do. And sometimes it's just bringing awareness about the pattern of the behavior. So I ask them to look objectively at the information. How can we maybe reframe, take action steps versus like, again, like there's a lot of emotion that's tied up into food and routines and habits and all of that kind of stuff. A lot of times I'll also ask them, what did they learn about themselves? Challenges that they faced when they were doing food tracking. And again, make it more of a conversation than like me telling them all the things that they did wrong. That's usually not a helpful conversation. So as much as you can, if you're reviewing somebody's log or any kind of tracking or self-monitoring, bring them into the conversation. Ask what they think about things first. How do you feel about your vegetable intake? Is there anything that you noticed with your snacks before I jump into and say like, I noticed your snacks had this, that, most people know what they're doing, and most people know what things that they're maybe doing that are not conducive to their health. And so you bringing it up sometimes can be, again, bringing up a lot of negative emotions, but if they bring it up, that can be a better conversation.
I feel like that's one of your, in particular, strengths, and that's one of the reasons that you've had some patients for like 5+ years.
Yeah.
And I think, because I don't sit in on your appointments or anything like that, but I've heard of the way you interact with patients, and you come off as like a conversational, sort of friendly person in, provider or whatever. I've had doctor's appointments where like I go and see my primary, and he's like, you should do this and stop doing this and blah. And I'm like, I don't really want to talk to my doctor. Like, it's not how it, but with you and with dietetics in general, I think dietitians, one of the biggest things you can do to develop a positive relationship with the patient is be conversational. You have a lot of opportunity to do that. And you could just as easily be like any other doctor where it's like, stop doing this, stop doing that, which just seems like the norm for primary care.
Yeah. And it's like the expert, the people talk about like the expert mode and like the expert trap. And that's a lot of it. Obviously, someone is coming to you because you are an expert. You are an expert in the field of nutrition and dietetics. They want your expertise. They want your input. But packaging it in the right way is kind of what we're talking about here. Not just jumping from, here's all the things you're doing wrong, or you should do this, this, and this, but bringing them into the conversation, having an actual conversation where it's two-sided and not just you telling them the things to do or to not do. And that I think makes the biggest difference is, again, if they're the ones coming up with, I noticed this and this, it doesn't mean you're not supposed to say anything about their logs. It just means that you wait to first get their input and then you come in with your expertise. And again, it's a balanced conversation. So
I feel like it all circles back to managing people and not stuff. And the person is the most important thing. And it doesn't really matter as much about the data and the thing. It's more about the person. Yeah. I feel like that's what your biggest strength is, why you have so many clients for so long, is that I have to imagine these patients feel like that you care about them more than anything. Yeah.
And part of that caring is asking their input. That's a lot, in dietetics, you probably learned about like building rapport. I mean, it's not just dietetics, but like building rapport with your patient, with your client, whoever that's going to be. And that is a lot of it is listening, actively listening, not just doing the majority of the talking, which is something that can be really easy to shift into because we want to share tips and strategies and problem solve and all of that. And sometimes that needs to hold off until you best understand the patient, but also, again, you bringing them into the conversation. And that's a lot of what I also try not to do with, it's so easy to fall into that when you're looking at somebody's log to be like, here's all the things they're doing wrong. And let's jump into problem solving. Instead of these chips, they can have an apple and peanut butter, and thinking of all these things. But again, that's not usually a helpful approach for patients long term. So
yeah, I have to imagine a food log like this, getting an idea of this, especially like a 7-day fully tracked. It's not just about the patient discovering what they're doing and tracking what they're doing. It really helps you as the dietitian to meet them where they are.
Yes.
Which is more important than anything.
Yeah. Because especially if we're looking at like managing a chronic condition, the first appointment can be pretty overwhelming, especially if it's a new diagnosis. Like I've had patients who they're just diagnosed with diabetes, and that's a big change for them, and there's so much information out there about like, you can't have carbs, you can't have this, and like misinformation. And then they're like thinking of all these things, thinking about medications, thinking about side effects, needing to see an endocrinologist, like all of these things are swirling around. And then they come into this appointment and it's like, I don't know, everything I've been doing is wrong, for the last 40 years, 50 years. And now they're thinking about, I have to change my routine, my habits, I have to start exercising. And that is overwhelming. And so if I can kind of get an idea of like, what's working in their diet right now that we don't have to mess with, what are some small changes that can be impactful for their blood sugar? Sometimes it's making sure they have 3 consistent meals so they're not just grabbing fast food on the way home from work because they're starving. So sometimes it's not even focusing in on like all of these healthy snack ideas. It's just having a lunch. And so that's something that if you don't have a conversation, you don't necessarily have food tracking for that. I can have a conversation with someone in an appointment, but if I just start giving them information about like how to manage diabetes, but really we just need to adjust like one meal, that's a lot less overwhelming for them.
So it's like there's tons of general information out there. They track their food. The conversation between you and them is very specific to them in their case, which is very helpful. It's always good to have specific information, just like you, the dietitian listening to this video. If you would like some specific guidance and help with your business, Felicia is available for consulting and phone calls and emails. We have packages. Feel free to sign up for a free consultation call. We start off with a 15-minute for free, a little freebie to check out where you're at and what you want to do. And if you determine it's helpful, you can sign up for regularly scheduled sessions with Felicia, personal guidance and help with wherever you are in your dietitian journey. How do you like that?
That was a really good segue.
Right in there with that ad spot. Where this video is sponsored by us. Yeah, all right.
It is sponsored by us.
It's true. We do offer some services if you're interested in more personalized help with your business. All right, back to the topic at hand. So what are some red flags with food tracking?
So definitely meal skipping. And part of why I bring this up is because it can be, especially if a patient's been consistently eating meals, 3 meals a day, and then all of a sudden they're skipping meals. It could be stress, underlying medical condition, like a GI condition. Maybe they're having like chronic pain and that's why they're skipping meals. And there could be other factors that are just like completely out of my scope to deal with. And so I might want to make sure that they are connected with their primary care physician, or if it's like relating to stress, maybe they're having a lot of anxiety or depression, maybe working with a therapist could be really helpful. And then also if their intake is really restrictive, there could be a concern with like an eating disorder in particular, which normally that's something that I screen for and make sure that I have an understanding of my patient before I start tracking, because I've had instances where I'll like ask someone, if they've ever done food tracking in the past, and they've said to me like, I have, but I get too caught up in like the calories or this and that. And so sometimes we don't want to be doing food tracking in particular. We might track in other ways because it could be a little too triggering for them. Also nutrient abnormalities, just from a dietitian perspective, the imbalance of macros or micronutrients, concerns with things like fiber and, especially if someone's having like constipation, for example, and I notice that they're not drinking enough water and eating enough fiber, that's obviously like a flag for me, not necessarily like an immediate concern where they need to like go to the hospital or something, but the kind of the restrictiveness is something.
So when there's a red flag, it's something that's pertinent that you feel the need to address promptly, I assume?
Yeah. And sometimes, if I notice, let's say someone's been tracking and then all of a sudden I see their food intake is like off from their normal pattern that I might see, I would want to address that with the patient. Is there something going on these 3 days? I noticed a little bit of a change in your behavior in what you tracked. And I just kind of wanted to get an idea of like what was going on that day. And a lot of times people will say, oh, I had a really stressful day at work, or I had a death in the family, or this or that. And so it's not me saying like, I noticed you had fast food on Friday, that's not good for you. But I'm saying like, hey, I noticed a change in your pattern. I'm just curious, was there anything that was going on that day? And honestly, more often than not, it's like something serious, like work, a death in the family, like their kid was sick, like something going on that like, and it's like, am I going to comment on that day of fast food? No, because it's a different circumstance. And so if it's something that happens consistently, we might talk about maybe strategies for managing when they have a busy day at work. What are maybe some quick, easy things to have on hand? But again, that's where having an actual conversation comes in.
And that's where you might dip into therapist territory. It's kind of a trap that ends up happening sometimes, depending on your patient.
Yes.
I think we have a podcast on how to manage that sort of thing too, how to move an appointment along and navigate sketchy topics. If I find the episode, I'll link it in the description. I'll also link in the description as well. Our website is always linked, but I'll link to where to sign up for consulting services if you're interested. So, are there any issues or concerns? We talked about a little bit of the issues with self-monitoring, some of the concerns. We already brought a few things up, but what else do you have on that?
So with a patient who's self-monitoring, especially for food journaling in particular, it's obviously going to be very dependent upon their honesty. And it's not to say that people are like outright trying to lie, but one of two things happen. Not one of two. One of a few things happen. One, someone might overestimate or underestimate what they're consuming. And it's not because they're trying to, pull one over on you. It's just they're maybe not using measuring cups. And they're just like, oh, this looks like a cup. This looks like a half cup. That's probably what that is. And then in reality, and in some of those cases, I might have them like measure it out. I usually say like measure once just to kind of see what it looks like. Put it on the plate, put it in the bowl. And they're like, wow, that's a half cup of cereal? Didn't realize that. I'm eating like 3 cups. But again, it's the whole idea is bringing awareness to it. So obviously very dependent upon honesty. I've also had instances where patients with, tracking in particular, that they have, they're like tracking and then they start eating better because they're going to send me the logs. And then they'll say to me, well, I really don't eat this way, but I knew that you're going to be looking at it. And so it's like that's where I might say to them when I'm looking at the logs, hey, how much of this is like typical of your usual intake? Is this something that's normal for you? Is this something that's out of the norm for you? Like, is this a good representation of your pattern? So that's usually something that, having a conversation about can help.
I just took a couple pictures of our dog being suspiciously cooperative right now. He's 9 months old and he is somehow just napping off camera, which is very nice. Usually he's puttering around. So
it's all the playtime he had.
Yeah, must be. What else do you think in terms of concerns?
Frequency and detail, that matters, especially about understanding behavior. If someone's tracking 1 day out of 7, they could be eating really well 1 day and maybe not the other 6 days. And so for you using that information, you don't really have much to go on. Tracking on its own is just not enough to make someone change their behavior. I think that that's like a perception, like, oh, if I'm tracking, I'm going to bring awareness and I'll start eating better. That's not necessarily the case. And I always tell people when you're tracking, it's for us to gather information. This is the information gathering stage. And then what we do from that will depend on what we see. Maybe it's education, maybe it's, strategies like motivational interviewing that I might use as a dietitian, or, maybe it's adjustments, swaps to make, whatever it might be, but it's information gathering.
Might someone change solely based on tracking? Might it influence their behavior in and of itself?
Absolutely. I've had patients where they start tracking and they're like, I realized I wasn't doing this, or I was doing this, or I wasn't drinking enough water. And so I've been trying to add in more water throughout the day. And sometimes that's also where like barriers can come up, or an opportunity for education. They might say, I started increasing my water, but going to the bathroom so much throughout the day, or I'm just not loving the taste of plain water. So what are strategies? So they might come then with questions for you and opportunities for you to, collaborate with them on some strategies to help them, reach a goal.
Some people don't do well with tracking. Do you want to talk a little bit about when tracking doesn't go well?
Yeah. So for some people, tracking, obviously tracking is time consuming, and depending on the method, if they are tracking using an app, trying to find the correct information, or if they don't eat a lot of processed packaged foods, which have a label on it that they can scan, that can also be problematic. Some people are not as tech savvy, so using an app might not also be the most feasible. With food journaling, like I mentioned, you're writing everything down. That's a time, but also time consuming, but also, carrying the papers along with them. I have a lot of patients that work like construction based kind of jobs, and they're not walking around with their tracking sheets in their pocket kind of thing. Weight tracking is not usually something that I recommend with patients, because a lot of times my patients, I'll find, become way too hyper fixated on the number on the scale. And this can be like, they might have decreased their A1C. They might have reduced their cholesterol, but their weight didn't budge. And so they're like really hyper fixating on that. And that isn't necessarily conducive to like mental health, but also, behavior change.
I think that's a product of the sort of like mainstream health ideas where people look at, social media has done so much damage to what people consider healthy or how people think about health. And then that's a battle that you then have to fight, where it's like your waistline is not the ultimate determinant of your health. It's all of it's your blood work, I feel like, is the most important thing, way more important than your body fat percentage. And that's not, you can't see that. You can't see your A1C at your waist. You see your excess body fat.
Yeah.
So I could see someone developing a weird relationship with certain metrics when the more important ones are moving, but the less important ones aren't. But then they think they're more important than they're not. And then you have to manage that. It becomes another part of your routine as a dietitian to inform patients of what actually matters.
Yeah. And for some people, when we start the process of working together, the first and second appointment, sometimes we're not setting detailed goals about changing their behavior. Again, it's information gathering. It's maybe some small adjustments like increasing their water intake, or, testing out some recipes or whatnot, or maybe walking 5 minutes at lunch or something like that. Like, we're not always setting these big lofty goals where their weight is going to change in the next week or two. And that's not the point. The point is we're starting to build a foundation of these healthy behaviors to support, if it is weight loss that can be sustained. And that's also a conversation that I have with people, just so it's like expectations in the beginning. Like, I will talk about, if they say like, I'm really interested in losing this much weight or that much weight, and saying like, the first couple appointments and the first couple months, I just want to say like, there could be some weight loss that occurs, but we're really trying to build behavior change strategies that are going to be a foundation, and not going to be, go on a diet, go off a diet. Like, that's not my approach. And most times when I have this conversation with patients, they're like, yeah, that's what I want to actually, I want something sustainable because I've been on 15 different diets in the past. So that can be a really good conversation. And if someone says like about weight tracking too, I bring up my concerns. Some people might get a little fixated on the weight and not the behavior changes that they're making. And again, having that conversation, 9 times out of 10, my patients will say, you're right. I usually do fixate on the number, and then I restrict or I go off my diet, and so they acknowledge it, but having the conversation with them brings attention to, here's why we don't want to use the scale. Here's why we want to track other things instead.
So we did talk a bit about how this can be triggering for some patients. I don't know if you had anything more to add on that.
So the biggest thing with, if it can be triggering for someone, is you really want to make sure you understand your patient and have built some rapport before you just start having them track. Now, when I first started, I used to send like a food log template before the first appointment. I stopped doing that years ago. It's something that I have a conversation about first. And then I also make sure that the patient is in the right like mental space to track, because again, if there's issues with anxiety, or there's issues with maybe disordered eating habits, maybe not an eating disorder, but disordered eating habits, and maybe some concerns with an eating disorder, that might not be on their initial paperwork or our initial conversation if I'm scheduling them. It's usually something that comes up in the appointment, again, if there's no official diagnosis. So making sure that they're in the best place, because again, food tracking, if they're looking at their intake and counting calories and all that kind of stuff using an app, then it could be triggering for them if they're, prone to more disordered eating habits.
So there are ways you integrate this food tracking stuff with the patient, and I imagine you have concerns about the way in which it's integrated. So can you talk about your strategies for that?
Yeah. So making sure that we actually have a conversation about why it's helpful, the information we're looking to achieve. And I say to them too, be as honest as possible on here. We're using this as information. This is just information for us to be able to decide, what's working, what's not, where are some areas that might need attention. So when you're putting the information down, think of it as information gathering, but having a conversation with them as to like, here's why I'm asking you to do this food tracking. And some people maybe are not going to do well with tracking their intake with an app. Some people, they might need, want to do just pen and paper, so they're not seeing the calories, the carbs, the fats, the protein, all of that kind of stuff. And it's just the information in terms of like the food intake. And in some instances, I've had patients where they're like, just tracking is too consuming or too triggering for me. And so we might just track in terms of like a behavior or a goal. So in that case, I have different templates where it's like they check off their goal or their behavior. So like it'll say like, a cup of vegetables at dinner Monday through Sunday, and then they just check it off and that's it. So they're just tracking the behavior itself versus like, here's what I had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and like all of those things. Or I've had patients use apps for like tracking just their water intake. There was an app that I had a couple patients using called Plant Nanny, where you're like literally watering a plant. And so it makes it fun.
So the water you're drinking in the app, it's watering a plant. And
yes.
If you don't drink enough water that day, the plant's going to die.
It's like it's all shriveled up and it's like really sad looking.
Really guilting you into drinking that water there. That's good. That's good strategy.
But it's like it's just like a fun little thing for them to do. And it's like, you could just click a button and it's like 8 ounces, 6. You could set like targets at the bottom. You could change like the pot color, like what it's in. And it's just like, so I've had patients really enjoy that, like where it's just tracking a certain behavior, like water intake, and not their entire food log.
That's a really good idea though.
Yeah.
If I knew how to develop apps, I would think a food tracking app where it gamifies your like macros and, it's something where it contributes to the health of a little pet or something. Like if you eat protein or fiber, it helps the pet. And if you eat sugar, it hurts it. I don't know if that would work or not for people. Do you remember the little devices people carried around like
Tamagotchi?
Yes. One for your food, like an app version for like a food tracker. I think that would be funny.
That would be funny.
Maybe that would influence behavior. Who knows? I don't know.
But it's more of a fun way of thinking about it. And that's the whole idea. It's like this, and that is much more sustainable for people to like do that than it is for them to like search every food or to like do all those things. And there's a lot of apps that track food and beverage, like you can log your water. But again, if we're just focusing on one behavior, and again, maybe the food intake we're focusing on, but the tracking of it is not going to be beneficial or helpful for this particular patient because of maybe risk factors or, their lifestyle, then using just, an app to track like an actual goal might be more beneficial.
So if you've made it this far on YouTube, please consider clicking that like button. Maybe subscribing to the channel would help us out a little bit, just have us show up a little more in the YouTube algorithm. If you're listening on Spotify or iTunes, please also, if you have a moment, rate us, maybe leave a review, what you like, what you don't like. We always enjoy receiving feedback. We're still learning, obviously. It's always a process to learn how to do these better. Any closing thoughts on self-monitoring here?
Biggest thing with self-monitoring, making sure that you are incorporating it with a patient in the way that's going to be the most useful for them. And again, it could be in a lot of different forms, everything from tracking goals to specific foods consumed, hunger, fullness surrounding meals. It can be more specific, like portion sizes, or can be other things like hydration. If they've checked off that they've had their medications and supplements, like there could be a lot of ways that you can go about self-monitoring with a patient. And again, a lot of it is focusing in on bringing awareness to a behavior to then be able to modify that behavior or maintain it if it's something that's supporting their health. But all that comes along with having a conversation with your patient as to what's going to be the best fit, and also being open to changing that if it's a strategy that ends up not working well for them.
All right. Well, there you have it, folks, from Felicia Peraza, the dietitian chancellor at My Dietitian Journey. That's some kind of goofy title. I don't know. What am I? Am I the emperor? Maybe I'll be the vice president.
Oh, that
sounds official enough, but with our times. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I don't know what our next one is, but we're back at it for the summer. Felicia's done teaching, and we've got more time now. So expect some more episodes in the near future. Maybe some weekly uploads. Maybe that's a little ambitious.
That is the goal.
Yeah, we'll see. But we're back at it. So thanks for being with us. Feel free to leave any comments, concerns, questions in the description. If you're listening, we do have a video version of the podcast if you want to see what we look like. And, any other interesting things in there's a piano back there. Not much going on in our studio. But anyway, that's going to do it for us here at the My Dietitian Journey Podcast. Thanks so much.